Thanks, Adam. Well, we've heard a lot in this conference, understandably, about scams. The figures as to the number of Australians being affected by scams are very concerning. And the response to this growing social and economic problem is what you'd expect. Our regulators have become very active, not only in their own efforts to combat the criminals, but in ramping up their expectations of what they expect from business, and in particular banks. Industry has responded. At the moment, it seems like almost every week there's a new initiative announced by a bank seeking to assist their customers to avoid scams. Indeed, we heard an initiative earlier today. And pleasingly, we're seeing now that there's an acknowledgement that the focus can't just be on banks. The solution or the answer to the combat to scams does involve a whole of ecosystem response, including telcos, social media platforms, and indeed customers themselves. We're also seeing that customers and non-customers who've been defrauded are naturally exploring whether they can recover some or all of their loss from banks involved in the relevant money transfers. And so dispute resolution bodies such as AFCA and increasingly the courts are having to grapple with the thorny question of when and in what circumstances a bank should be liable when a scam occurs. So, as we near the end of this conference, it's opportune to bring some of this together and hear from some of those who are on the front line, so to speak, of this fight. Now, it's normally politic to start with the regulator, so my first question's to Brad. What role is AUSTRAC playing in safeguarding the community from the increasing threat of scams?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks for the opportunity. As people in this room would know, AUSTRAC is both a anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regulator, but we're also the financial intelligence unit of Australia. And I think it's in that particular domain that we offer quite a bit. And perhaps if I start globally, AUSTRAC and Australia is part of an entire global network of financial intelligence units. We have relationships with well over 100 jurisdictions in which we share information and intelligence upon that certainly has related to frauds and scams and led to arrests around the world in relation to activity that's necessarily transpiring on the back of information that's presented to us from banks in Australia. Domestically, we work with law enforcement, national security, other regulatory partners and revenue partners in relation to a myriad of crimes, but certainly increasingly frauds and scams. And those agencies, they all have online access to AUSTRAC's database, which has millions and millions of financial transactions, and conduct an incredible number of searches to actually help them with their investigations in relation to particular criminal activities. And importantly, we have a partnership, and that partnership is both with them and also with yourselves in industry. First and foremost, we have the AUSTRAC's public-private partnership, the Fintel Alliance, which brings together both law enforcement and industry together to understand the particular threats that we face and actually to sort of bring information together which actually helps the broader industry in relation to particular pieces of work. So that transpires into what we call financial crime guides, which is in many cases jointly written with our industry partners, and the ones that perhaps most recently relate to frauds and scams are things around ransomware. We have done work in relation to fraud upon the NDIS scheme. We've had a look at the misuse of cryptocurrencies. We've had a look at the phoenixing of businesses, which obviously has an element around fraud and scams, and also the abuse and exploitation of disaster payments. So all of those particular reports have involved yourselves as partners with us, and I expect there'll be a continuing focus together with some of the new bodies that have been established, the National Anti-Scam Centre, to actually help continue to build the awareness of the particular scams and the information that we provide to yourselves.
Thanks, Brad. I guess bringing in you, Gerard, now, we've heard during this conference as to how the scams seem to be continually evolving. The scammers are becoming more sophisticated. I guess in your role, what particular types of scams are you seeing at the moment?
Thanks, Andrew. And I guess if I just pick up on the introduction from Adam, whether we're talking about scams, financial crime, fraud more broadly, it is an insidious problem, and it's a problem that is getting worse. The challenge with an insidious problem is it can very quickly become quite emotive. It can become a headline that can get kind of distracted in, I think, some of the noise. And one of the key things that I think we need to be doing here is making sure that we're kind of breaking down the problem and just understanding a little bit more about it. So, for example, if we think about some of the data that's coming through from ACCC, and this is all available for everybody, we can see we have to firstly think about unauthorised versus authorised issues. And I know we've covered some of this topic over the last couple of days, so hopefully not repeating too much of it. But even within whether it's authorised and unauthorised, we're going to need to be thinking about volume as well as value, and then looking for the trends to say where can we have the biggest impact quickly. So, for example, obviously not a surprise, text is both rapidly increasing on the volume and the value side. Right? Phone is decreasing on the volume but increasing on the value. So there's possibly a bit of a signal into there as to perhaps the type of person who's more prone to being impacted through a phone-related scam or fraud. If we think about social networking, that's reasonably low on the volume but exponentially increasing again on the value. And that might also be a connection to some data coming out of the UK, which is showing around about a 13% increase in romance-based scams and fraud. So just trying to build the patterns of what's decreasing, what's increasing, what's happening, then ultimately helps us get to a better place where I think we can have a more structured conversation. So we try to push to make sure that we're specific in the conversation, not to atomise the problem. We don't want to make, scams are one thing, fraud separate, and we break it all down. That can be, I think, overly simplistic. But by being clear on the trends, understanding the problem that we're trying to fix, and then collectively working with other industries, there is an opportunity to move forward and progress quickly.
Thanks, Joe. Sharon, scams obviously can have a devastating effect on individuals. I guess, can you talk us through what you're seeing in terms of the impact of scams on NAB's customers and what NAB is seeing at the front line?
Yeah, well, so devastating is the word, and insidious another. We are just seeing more and more people being deeply affected by scams. So at NAB in FY22, the last financial year, scams increased 38% on the year before. In the first half of this year, we're double, 100% on the same period the year before. So we are exponentially growing in terms of the number of customers who are being impacted by scams. Our fraud line now takes 85,000 calls a month from customers who have either been scammed or think that they've been scammed. So it's a massively growing and serious problem. As Gerard said, there are all sorts of different scam types. The ones that we are seeing the most of, so a very important point as to number and value. So the most number of scams we see are the remote access scams, but they're not so high in value. The real financial impact comes from investment scams and romance scams, as Gerard said. Then we've got business email scams and fourth are phishing. So they're the ones that we're most seeing. And as Gerard touched on, the type of scam victim is very different to what we used to imagine it to be. So it's not just old people anymore, and it's not people who have failed to realise that the grammar or the punctuation in emails isn't all that it should be. Scams are, as we know, becoming incredibly sophisticated, and every one of us could be, and many of us in this room will have been, victims of scams ourselves, even though we consider ourselves to be relatively sophisticated users of financial services. So we are seeing scams right across our customer cohort, and it's not just individuals either, of course, it's businesses as well. And so we did some research recently and found that 1 in 3 small and medium businesses had been victims of either scams or cyber attacks in the last year, losing on average about $19,000. So it's across the whole of our client base, Andrew.
mean, some of those figures, Sharon, are just remarkable.
Shocking.
In terms of the number of
85,000.
85,000, amazing, and scary. And I guess that turns, Gerard, to sort of how can technology sort of help in this space? I guess given your role, I'm sure you have a few thoughts about how technology could assist in the fight against scams, both in terms of detection and prevention.
Certainly, and I suppose the first point when we get to a technology conversation on this topic is that the problem side of the equation or the solution side of the equation. And I'll always use the simple example of steel. We use steel to make motor cars and it gets made to make bullets, right? So the technology that we're using to try and protect our customers is unfortunately the same technology that's being used against us. And that means that it's a continuously escalating and changing landscape. If I think on the protection side, many areas may seem quite basic, but they are very important when we think about customer education. Not so much the fact that it's needed, I think everybody's on board with that, but how do you do that in a timely fashion? How do you do that in-app? Perhaps, clearly it's not much point emailing people things at the moment because they're not going to read it in the first place. So thinking about your broader strategy to communicate with your customer and then making sure that the information they're getting is easy to consume and timely has such a profound impact, and technology plays a key role in that communication. If we drop into some of the more specific things on the protection side, it could be with the telcos as we think about things like do not originate and what can we do to help with some of the protection from the call centre related or what appear to be call centre impersonation type scams, through to how do we continue to provide greater protection around SIM porting and so forth to help with re-registration of customers. Equally, on the AI side, there's clearly a significant opportunity there as to how do we use AI and machine learning in a range of different ways. A simple example is we are already, most organisations today are doing an element of scanning and vulnerable threat analytics across things like internet banking. Through that, we're able to pick up a range of different behaviours. Some of those would be more in the cyber crime category, but through that same activity, we can also pick up certain activity which helps lead to either directly or potentially sometimes working with people such as AUSTRAC to help identify particular behaviours from known actors who are beginning to drive scam activity at scale. Right? I think on the detection side, this is an area which is increasingly becoming, particularly when we think about the rise of mobile banking, an important area. And this is where I was going earlier with the idea around what is scam versus fraud, and does it matter, or do we just put it all together and protect the customer? Something like a dynamic CVV is particularly helpful with fraud, but doesn't really help with a scam where the customer has authorised the payment. So we hear announcements about where certain technology is being used. I think it's important to understand that what particular piece that will impact. Whereas work that we're doing at ANZ with things like our behavioural biometrics, building a portfolio of 200 or so different inputs, which might be anything from how you normally hold the phone, how fast you normally type on the keyboard, the type of device you've got, building that information. If we see a payment being requested and it doesn't quite match that basket, if you like, of metrics, then we might elevate that particular request to a higher level of inspection, possibly even ask you to, in the case of our new app, a selfie, just to confirm again that it's you before we actually release that money. So a number of different levels, from simple communication right the way through to behavioural biometrics, that can all play an important role in protecting our customers and then detecting when things go wrong.
Thanks, Gerard. Brad, I mentioned at the outset the heightened expectations of our regulators around what they're hoping sort of banks are doing. What advice would you be able to give to banks about what you're expecting in terms of their response to scams and fraud?
Thanks. It's always good when you actually sit on a panel and you actually get the comments from the regulated entities that are right on song too, so that always works. That's very favourable. But putting my regulator hat on, and I think both Sharon and Gerard already touched upon the complexity and the nature of the different scams, etc., that are out there. In terms of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing obligations, front and centre for ourselves. Understanding risk is absolutely essential to that. If you understand the risk, you can consider then what the types of mitigation might be necessarily in place to respond to that. We would have necessarily all the businesses that are impacted by different crimes trying to build a contemporary knowledge of the types of scams and fraud that they're actually faced by. That can go so far as to understand the profiles, which you've already mentioned, about who is more likely to be impacted by which particular types of criminal activity there is. I think that's sort of fundamental. Beyond that, there's the understanding of which jurisdictions are at play when necessarily the money flows from Australia offshore to oftentimes where ultimately the criminals are benefiting from necessarily the abuse of the Australian as a consumer. So bringing those elements together, obviously there's significant information, both whether it be advice from law enforcement, alerts that come out, obviously Scam Watch that provides information that was touched upon, advice and information from ourselves. I think collectively that information is invaluable in terms of what businesses need to necessarily do. I would go further and then talk about necessarily that customer due diligence that is required, and we talked about necessarily whether you flash up a selfie to prove who you are, but an important consideration again in our legislation is necessarily having an ongoing relationship with a customer that actually allows you to understand what is otherwise legitimate in terms of their behaviour, but things that actually might stray from that, and the inconsistency would necessarily lead the institution to make a decision about whether they put a stop on a payment or hold a payment or actually consider that some other contact would actually help to mitigate that risk. And for me, ultimately, and it's sort of been mentioned, our position, and I dare say most of law enforcement that we deal with, it would be far better for us to prevent and protect the nation from necessarily the offence than actually try and chase down and try and get back the funds or trying to identify people who are necessarily perpetrating against that. So prevention is always better, I would suggest, than the cure in that respect. So there are probably a couple of elements that I think are important, and I think it was also touched upon. I sort of meant just the AI and the capability. So again, transaction monitoring and understanding that whether the transaction is actually legitimate or whether there's some inconsistency there, incredibly important. And another plug to the entities that we deal with. There's an enormous amount of effort and work goes in within the banking system to try and prevent as much of this from occurring as possible. We are aware of that. We have that genuine partnership where we're seeking to have that even further and continue to try and make a bit of a dent in what is an otherwise escalating crime.
And Sharon, whilst prevention is obviously better, inevitably scams are occurring and will continue to occur. What's NAB doing to help support scam victims, and what do you think needs to happen to sort of help customers sort of not be subject to be victim to scams in the future?
Yeah, well, first of all, Brad, thank you for saying that about the banks. And he wasn't paid to do that, I'm sure. But I think that's a really important point, that there isn't a competitive advantage to be had by the banks in finding out a way of stopping scams and not telling each other. And I know that Anna and the ABA has worked with the banks to try and raise all boats. And, we saw the announcement by CBA today at NAB, and it went right around NAB saying, what are we doing? Are we doing this? And it's a great way of actually improving all of the time. And I think we do work collaboratively together to make it a tougher environment for scammers and fraudsters. So I think that's a really important point. I mean, obviously, in terms of supporting customers, just like the other banks, we are spending tens of millions of dollars to try and A, support our customers, and B, stop scams. Clearly, if we're getting 85,000 calls a month to our fraud lines, we have had to put a lot more people on the lines and spend millions of dollars, not only employing the people to take those very difficult calls, but training the people not only in systems and how to try and get the money back, or on those rare occasions where you can get in early, stop the scam, but also looking after customers in a time of incredible emotional distress. And then we need to look after the people who are taking the calls, who also themselves go through a lot of emotional distress given the calls and the nature of what they hear about. So we spend an enormous amount of time, money and effort in looking after both our customers and our people. Chris Sheehan, who runs Scams, he doesn't perpetrate the scams himself. He tries to stop them. At NAB has a nice saying, and that is that we have to realise that scams aren't going away. This is a problem that we are going to be talking about in 10 years' time. What's happening, though, is that we're seeing different sorts of scams and the evolution of scams. And so as we identify one problem and solve it in some way, another version of scam comes up. It's a bit like a game of whack-a-mole. So at the end of the day, Andrew, to your point, it's actually about prevention, obviously, and trying to stop the scams from happening. And as you've heard from the panel today, that's a combination of things. It's about technology, it's about education, and it's actually about getting the whole of the ecosystem. So financial sector working together, and as has been touched on already, telcos, social media, you know, what's going on at WhatsApp. I mean, we need a Team Australia approach to combating scams. And I don't know that we've been as good as a nation in doing that as we could be. And I think it's something that the government is absolutely looking at to try and get us all together and focus. But just showing the advantage of getting the ecosystem working for you. We've had the problem, as all of the banks have, with spoofing, with people who impersonate NAB by using NAB email addresses or by using NAB telephone numbers so that the poor customer believes they're talking to NAB, gives away all of the information and is scammed. By working with one of the telcos, we were able to reduce the number of spoofing scams by 50% in 1 month when we, in effect, closed the pipes down. That is the telco pipes, not the nothing to do with what's going on in the bank. So that's an example of one mole that has been whacked, and something else will pop up somewhere else. The other thing, obviously, is education, and the ABA is running an excellent campaign for general education to try and have people take personal responsibility for the decisions they're making, often in the instant. You know, it's not a considered thing that people do often with scams. They push a button or they provide information without spending time thinking about it. So general education, which makes our customers being more curious, more aware of the different sorts of scams, and generally more sceptical of something that they're receiving in social media, email, text. You know, look at the scams recently allegedly from children coming after their mums wanting money urgently, for example. So general education is important, but I think, as has been touched on already, the most important way and the best way that we can stop scams is in the moment. So actually being able to put some friction in the system as somebody's about to try and send money somewhere, and if we identify a red flag in relation to that transaction, and as discussed, we're becoming increasingly sophisticated in doing that, being able to say to the customer, no, you know, we don't think you should be making this transaction at the moment, and putting some friction and making them think about it more. That is actually the most important thing I think that we can be doing at the moment, and the most effective thing to try and protect our customers into the future.
Thanks, Sharon. When things go wrong and the scam happens, I mentioned earlier the liability question, which is, when will the banks be liable for some or all of the losses suffered by the scam victim? We heard in one of the breakout sessions yesterday about the contingent reimbursement code in the UK, the practical effect of which is the banks are usually held liable whether or not they're at fault. Now, thankfully, we don't have anything like that in Australia at present, and I'm reasonably hopeful that it won't come our way. At least in my view, Financial Services Minister Stephen Jones got it absolutely right when about 7 months ago he said, if banks always pay, the net result creates a honeypot for scammers. So instead, what we're seeing in Australia at the moment is scam victims sort of seeking to recover losses through either complaints to AFCA, or increasingly I'm seeing claims actually brought in court. And to date, AFCA and the courts are taking on the whole a very sensible approach. All those involved in handling these claims, I mean, have tremendous sympathy for the scam victims, but sympathy alone is not a good basis on which to make decisions around legal liability. And AFCA has made clear in a number of recent determinations that the bank's primary duty is to make payment in accordance with the customer's instructions, and that the bank does not generally have any obligation to monitor the customer's use of funds on their behalf, or to maintain watching briefs for scams on behalf of the customer, or to prevent the customer dealing with funds they're entitled to access. And that statement of the law, I think, has to be right. Now, of course, there will be situations where the bank is sufficiently aware of circumstances that it shouldn't process the payment. But to date, the courts and AFCA are requiring a reasonably high degree of knowledge before they are imposing liability on the bank. And I guess from my part, I'm hoping that that trend will continue. We've got a few minutes left. I wonder whether I could ask the panel if any of you have a short key message that you'd like to leave with our audience. Should we start with you, Brad?
Well, I mean, I think the key message, and I think we've perhaps all mentioned it, and we may mention it again. It's that we can't do this alone. There's a role that industry has, and multiple different industries necessarily have, and from AUSTRAC and our perspective, we understand and we value necessarily the partnership that we have, with industry, and I know at times, yes, we act as the regulator and we'll take action where we necessarily need to, but far and wide, our focus and our effort is on actually working together with industry to actually, get to the bottom of some of these challenges, try and face these challenges together, try and mitigate the risks that we necessarily face, and not necessarily allow an enormous amount of money to flow from victims, to flow around the world, to get into the coffers of some other criminal that we would otherwise not want to have money from Australians.
Gerard?
I guess for me, while we acknowledge that this has been a problem for a time and is clearly continuing to be a significant issue, the two things that are changing for me, one is the speed of movement, and secondly, the scale with which it's happening. And those two things combined mean that if we get back to the old cyber defence truism, I suppose, you're as strong as your weakest link, which is why the holistic approach to solving this is really the only way we're going to be able to deal with that speed and scale that now confronts us.
And for me, it's about changing human behaviour. It's about education and making people take some real responsibility for the decisions they're making in the moment.
And I guess with my litigator hat on, I would say that I think it's important for banks to continue to do what they are of seeing what others are doing in the industry and picking up good ideas and trying to keep up with best practice, both here in Australia and also looking to what's occurring overseas. Because where you don't continue to keep up with best practice, that's when the liability questions might really become, I think, more real. We might leave it there. Can I ask everyone to thank our panel, Sharon, Gerard, and Brad?
Thanks, Andrew.